Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the U.S.-Asia Institute's webinar series, Governing the Global Climate Emergency, India's Path to a Resilient Future. My name is John Kannan, and I'm a program assistant at the U.S.-Asia Institute. For those of you who have attended our events in the past, welcome back, and for those who are new to the U.S.-Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 47-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. Today's webinar is focused on the rising frequency of extreme weather events in India and the Indian government's response, subnationally and nationally, to these disasters. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our corporate stakeholders: FedEx, Coupang, Suntory, AIG, Aiken, Fairfield Maxwell, PMI, Google, Organon, and the Korea Foundation for helping make programs like this one possible. I'd now like to introduce our moderators. First, Ms. Shazia Rafi. Ms. Rafi is the president of AirQualityAsia, a parliamentary advocacy group working on implementing the Clean Air UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. Previously, for 18 years, she served as the Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization of elected legislators from over 100 countries, founded in Washington, D.C. Ms. Rafi serves as a managing director of Global Parliamentary Services, an organization that helps legislatures, governments, and nonprofits expand their regional and international reach and improve their outcomes. She also served on the advisory board of the United Nations Democracy Fund from 2012 to 2013. Next, Mr. Abishek Kumar. Mr. Kumar is the founding partner at Indicc Associates. In the past, Mr. Kumar was director at Cuts International and led the public policy division at the organization. He's also worked with Ernst & Young, Royal Bank of Scotland Foundation, Digital Empowerment Foundation, members of Parliament, UN assignments, and as a senior news editor at CNN-IBN. He has authored and co-authored several chapters and op-eds for mainstream publications and has edited 2 books, besides making 50 documentaries on development issues in India. We are very grateful to have both Ms. Rafi and Mr. Kumar moderating today's discussion. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Ms. Rafi to say a few words and introduce our panelists. As a final note to the audience, please make sure to put any questions that you have in the chat.
Thank you, Jahnavi. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, namaskar and good evening. On behalf of AirQualityAsia, I welcome you to this important webinar by the US-Asia Institute, with whom we have partnered since 2017. As you already heard, AQA is a parliamentary advocacy group working to implement the SDGs related to clean air, and their links to the Paris Treaty on climate change. India has, of course, played a major role in these agreements and frameworks. Air pollution is, of course, an accelerator of climate change. The same carbon emissions that speed up global warming make air quality worse. At the same time, air quality monitoring gives us real-time progress measure. The challenge for South Asian governments is enormous. The geological maps of the Indo-Gangetic Plain from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal show a trough and a plain bordered by the world's highest peaks. So whatever chemical pollution our economies generate stagnates there, giving our region the world's highest air pollution levels. Of the world cities with the highest air pollution, whether we count the top 20, the top 40, whatever, almost 80 to 90% are in South Asia, of which, a large percentage are in India. And this, of course, leads to deaths from respiratory illnesses, asthma, COPD, air pollution, lung cancer, stroke deaths, heart disease. They even say it affects IQ. The difficulty for policymakers is the actual cost of this air pollution to the economy. In the World Bank report of 2016, India had a 7.8% negative GDP impact of air pollution. Now, later reports show a higher percentage, but even if we use the 2016 7.8%, the amount of money leaking out of the economy due to air pollution in 2025 would be an estimated $322 billion. These are staggering amounts, and these funds could easily be applied for crucial development needs. So I think the issue is how do you transition what is being lost into a gain, and how do you move the transition of lowering carbon emissions, both in how we generate energy, in how we move our transportation systems, the kinds of fuels we are using, to a zero emissions economy. We know it can be done because what COVID showed us was that when we stopped the economies, which of course is not feasible on a permanent basis, you suddenly had blue skies and air quality within the good range. Delhi had blue skies, Jalandhar could see the Himachal peaks again. But we must build back these economies in a better way. And India is well on its path with the National Clean Air Plan, with expanded renewable energy. Installed capacity is now at 35.6 for renewable energy. And if we add hydro, it goes a little above 45%. Accelerating to zero emission transportation systems, both public and private, is also taking place, particularly in the three-wheeler category. Both passenger and cargo are at 32 and 22% respectively. But the economy is still chugging along on the basis of these fossil fuels. At one point, I remember looking at the statistics, and Delhi was adding 1,400 new cars a day to the metropolis. At that pace, it's very hard to have the acceleration towards a clean air economy move faster than the regular polluted economy. But I think part of the role of government, both at the federal and the state level, is to ensure that while the transition is being made by both the public and the private sector to a clean air economy, the public sector has to stop subsidizing polluting power plants, industries, and polluted fuel. That still continues to be the case in many of our countries in South Asia, including India. So whose job is it to get these implementations of goals and standards and laws done? The bulk of the responsibility and the power to implement is with national and state governments and court systems in enforcing these federal and state laws. The main hurdle in India, as in the United States, even after 40 years of implementing the EPA regulations in the US, the main hurdle remains the power of the fossil fuels industry and their capacity to continue to lobby governments to keep it slow, to not move fast enough, or in some cases, as we're seeing in the US, to even reverse federal laws. So India, like the US, is a federation of states. So our work at AQA, while it started at the federal level with the national parliament, has moved to state legislative assembly members and state governments. And for that, I will, like my colleague Abishek Kumar, to say a few words. Before I do that, hand it over to him, I would like to just introduce our speakers so that they can take over right after that. Mr. Sameer Kwatra leads the NRDC's India program to advance clean energy, clean transportation, public health, and locally effective climate solutions in the country. Prior to joining NRDC, Kwatra worked for the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, where he sought to improve energy efficiency in buildings. He became interested in environmental issues while working for ICICI Prudential in rural India, where he saw that the people who were the most with the least to the cause. Kwatra holds a degree in mechanical engineering from India's National Institute of Technology, an MBA in finance from the Indian Institute of Management, and a master's degree in environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's based in NRDC's Washington, D.C. office. Just as a footnote, my first work in this field was in 2002 while I was still SG of PGA, and NRDC was an institution that we worked very closely with on using the US Clean Air, Clean Water Act model as legislation, as model legislation to other countries. Our second speaker is Mr. Aditya Raghwa, Head of Government and Policy South Asia at the Climate Group, based in New Delhi. Aditya Raghwa leads Climate Group's engagement with South Asian states and provinces, guiding them on energy efficiency policy, climate finance, and industrial decarbonization, Prior to joining Climate Group in 2023, he advised Indian corporates and ministries at the CII-ITC Center of Excellence for Sustainable Development, focusing on climate policy and ESG strategy. With a background in environmental economics, he has worked in this field for several decades now. So I would just like Abishek Kumar just to add a few words about our state level work, and then hand over to our first speaker, Mr. Samir Kwatra. Abishek.
Thank you, Shazia. Thank you, US Asia Institute. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Samir, Janvi, Aditya for joining. Straight off the bat, really glad that we've had a great opportunity to work with AirQualityAsia, with members of parliament in India. And that conversation has been going on for, I would say, last couple of years. It has only intensified in the way that I can tell you that when AirQualityAsia, when I started working with AirQualityAsia in India, there were conversations which were still at a nascent stage. And today when I see how members of parliament, the community has increased, of course, it's chaired by Dr. Shashi Tharoor, but how not just the community has increased, but the level of conversations have also increased. So we started off with very nascent ideas of just transition and energy transition. And today we are talking really about solutions. We're really about networks, really about action, how states can play a great role. And since Shazia mentioned about federal polity, I think this work has been able to get us to states as close as possible to states as one can imagine, in a way that from members of parliament, the community has even expanded to organizations which are working at the state level. So yes, in brief, that's what I can say. And as we go forward, I think we are at the right place at the right time. India has just announced its new NDCs, which have revised the targets upwards. And no better time and place to then talk about how we can achieve them. So with that, let me turn to Samir. I was just fascinated, and of course we've met in the past, but when you read a colleague's CV, we interact, but when you read a colleague's CV, then you realize, oh, this is also something that you've done. And what I found absolutely fascinating about NRDC and particularly about Samir, your work, is that you have been an engineer coming from a technical background, and then you went into rural development, and then you did an MBA, and then environment management, and now you're in DC. And so you've seen it all from the technology side, from the finance side, from the rural side. So straight off the bat to you, Samir, how do you look at the new NDCs in India? What's your take on it? And typically from your vantage point, how do you see climate mitigation adaptation work unfolding as we go along?
Thanks, Abhishek. Thanks to US Asia Institute for inviting me for this conversation. And thanks everyone who's joined us today. It's a pleasure. NRDC, for those who do not know, Natural Resources Defense Council is a 55-year-old nonprofit working largely in US, but also across the world, including in India, on nature, on health and climate, those three interlinked issues. In India, we've been working for about 15 years on health as well as climate issues, and within climate, both climate mitigation, some of the things you touched upon, Abhishek, as NDCs, and Shazia, you mentioned as well, but also increasingly on the adaptation side, resilience to extreme weather events, which India is already facing. I know the new NDC that came out from India is a hot topic. I would just briefly say that it's commendable that a large economy like India has added to climate commitments at this otherwise very intense geopolitical time when there are lots of conflicting and cross-sectional interests at play. So India coming up with clear goals increases the total number of players that have committed to acting on climate. But I wanted to actually dive a little deeper into the resilience aspect of India's climate policy and adaptation that India has been building on. With your permission, is it okay to spend like 6-7 minutes on what's happening and what India is doing? Or
absolutely, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So what is happening is India is has the largest, most vulnerable population to extreme weather impacts, be it extreme heat or other multi-hazards, such as floods, such as cyclones, droughts, and often many of these impact the same communities, and either in rapid succession or sometimes, even overlapping. Generally, India has a heat season starting from the south of the country from March to end of May, and then the monsoons, the high precipitation season starts. What has been happening over the last decade is India's heat season is starting much earlier and is longer, is more intense. On an average, the last 2-3 years, India has seen 50 plus extreme heat days. And the way India describes extreme heat is different than in many other parts of the world. It is very common to have 100-degree plus days, 120 degrees, 45-degree centigrade, if you're more familiar with that. What we're seeing in the last 3-4 years is that in addition to these extreme heat days, nights are becoming warmer. So there is less time for recovery from extreme heat. There is also urban heat island impact, which is felt especially in cities, because there is concrete, and generally cities have release heat during the evening. So therefore, most vulnerable communities within the cities don't have a time to recuperate. So India is looking at climate adaptation and climate impacts as not just something seasonal, but rather as economy-wide health and development issues. Sort of what you were mentioning, Shazia, air quality and its impact on the economy. Similarly, extreme heat, climate impacts are a development issue in India. What is happening is extreme weather not just strains the public health infrastructure, but it also has a huge impact on power demand in the country and on the water supply in the country. And sometimes when these events happen together, there is an impact on food production, on critical health infrastructure, and also on productivity, especially for people who are either working outdoors or are in highly exposed industries. But India has been tackling, and not just at the national level, but also at the state level, heat and extreme weather events for the last several years. At the national level, India's National Disaster Management Agency, NDMA, has put together frameworks and guidelines that states and cities can adopt to build these plans for coping with extreme weather events and also increasing adaptive capacity. India's national agency in Indian Meteorological Department, IMD, has been issuing long-range weather forecasts. And so there is the early warning aspect of it, making sure that more and more people reach. There is the health system preparedness part of it, public health infrastructure being ready at the city level. And then there is the interagency coordination to respond to these. And many of the cities have put together these heat action plans. But along with these, what is now happening is a realization of the interrelatedness of climate adaptation and mitigation. So heat, for example, is a two-sided issue. On one is responding to extreme heat, and on the other side is providing access to cooling, which is sustainable and affordable. And if India was to go the way of other developed countries and use air conditioning as the one solution to cope with extreme heat, sheer number of air conditioners required in India actually exacerbate the problem. India still has less than 10% of houses that have ACs. So any solution for cooling has an impact on accentuating heat impacts and other extreme weather impacts, and which is why it is critical to look at these two in an interrelated way. India has about 500 million ceiling fans, for example, but there is projections forecast that says that by 2030, India will have about 900 million ceiling fans. That's like the first entry level appliance that most households have to cope with extreme heat. But if these 900 million ceiling fans were to use current level of energy, then the climate impact is enormous. And conversely, and if we can have these be the most efficient available models, then not only people can afford them, but also there's a climate impact. So a lot of states and cities in India have been putting together heat resilience systems, climate resilience systems. India has also developed its own national adaptation plan. And what is interesting there is a template in India at the city, state, and national level, which is applicable even now in many other countries which are building climate resilient infrastructure, but also increasingly in other places where we are seeing extreme heat and other climate events rising. So a lot to learn from, example that India has already instituted. I'll pause.
Thank you, Samir. I completely agree. I mean, this is this is not any more siloed approach. This is interconnected approach, and I would say that when we work with Indian states, engage different actors at the state level, but also at the national level, and what we've seen over last decade is that there has been a sort of evolution of narrative. A good part of the first decade of the last decade that we've been part of, we had a stated position that we're not going to be adding more fossil assets. And that was also driven by how finance was moving globally, including World Bank, IFC, BlackRock, what have you were there. But now you have geopolitical fluctuations, supply side disruptions, and all kinds of things which have gotten us to a point where we're talking about energy security, which basically means that the stated position of government of India as of 2022 was that, of course, you got to feed mouths first, to keep them alive. So higher penetration of renewable energy, but at the same time, more tonnage of coal. And this is not something that I would say we wanted to do. It's something that has been forced upon because of what's happening around the world. But in that context, again, I will stay with the idea of resilience, because resilience is that particular aspect where if you focus on resilience, and I say it jokingly that you take out corruption from all over the world, from all societies, you will have resilient infrastructure. But be that as it may, resilience has now become the heart of the issue. Resilience in mitigation, resilience in adaptation, but really, what do we understand of resilience? And let me turn to Aditya. Aditya, from your perspective, from a global perspective, because at the climate group, you look at a lot of things that is happening globally. What do you think of, how do you see resilience from in the Indian context, and how this can be shaped? Staying with Samir's thoughts here.
Thanks, Abhishek, and thanks to the US Asia Institute for having me. It's a pleasure to join the conversation today. So, what I'd like to really share is coming from what I like to think is a practical perspective, right? In our role and at the Climate Group, we are the Secretariat for the Under 2 Coalition, which is the world's largest network of subnational governments that are committed to leading climate action. And, it's about 170 state and regional governments. Of course, they include states and regions in India and the United States as well. And what we're really seeing is states and regions are really on the front lines of climate impacts and climate solutions, right? So what I'd like to talk about is what's actually working, what governance systems are kind of succeeding, what we're struggling with, and what are the means for strengthening the resilience that we like to talk about. So from that perspective, there is a governance and a resilience challenge that we face, right? Sameer's already talked about it. India is experiencing heat waves, flooding, water stress, agricultural, yields that, get there's fluctuations. And so it's not just a simple environmental risk, it's an economic risk, it's a public health risk, it's an infrastructure stress. There's even national security implications behind it, to which, you talked about, Abhishek, right? Like we're being forced into certain things that, if situations where otherwise you might not have to get into that. So the challenge is no longer really ambition. It's about how do we actually deliver resilience and at scale, right? And we think that the answer really lies at the state and subnational level, because that's where local impacts are. That's where the issue actually is. You cannot, there's a national adaptation plan, and a lot of countries have them, but the actual action has to be taken in some state, in a particular country, right? So there's a lot of opportunity, that being said, right? Like, so India has an opportunity to strengthen governance for delivery. Sameer's talked a little bit about the NDCs. What struck me more than the fact that they, raised ambitions, right, and raised the ceiling, is that there was the press statement actually had a lot of focus on adaptation. They talked about protection of vulnerable coastlines, coastal regulation, building climate resilient infrastructure to address risk from landslides, floods, glacier melting, targeted programs for glacier monitoring, and Shazia referred to it, just the whole Hindu Kush, Himalayan, this thing. There's a lot of focus being put on that. Implementations of heat action plans across states, community-based disaster preparedness. All of this is actually mentioned in India's press release. So even in its economic survey, that's what it talks about. It talks a lot about how adaptation and resilience is just as important as mitigation. But the reality is we do need to stop talking about it in terms of just strategic stuff, right? And there needs to be more and more implementation frameworks. Some of those are already, of course, coming into place, but a lot of work yet to be done. The question is, how do these frameworks embed adaptation across infrastructure considerations, agriculture planning, urban development planning, finance, right? Climate budgeting is a good example of this. Climate Group recently concluded a project called Next Gen Budgets. It's basically a question about how does your state or national budget align with your climate goals. And we're not saying that climate budgets are only a green budget. It goes a little bit beyond that. You need to actually align with both mitigation goals, but also with the resilience and climate proofing goals, right? Because there's a lot of intersection now that's happening. There are countries and states that are actually doing this really well. Scotland has a national adaptation plan, 2024 to 29, if I'm not mistaken, which actually embeds adaptation as a part of law. There's a clear governance and there's a monitoring through a climate emergency board. They clearly prioritize nature-based solutions, resilient infrastructure, community participation. Flanders in Belgium has a task force that spans multiple policy areas and has treated adaptation and resilience as a cross-department, cross-government policy priority. Again, so adaptation is actually a part of economic and spatial planning in Flanders. And again, a strong focus on nature-based and workforce readiness. So there's a lot going on there. The second opportunity is really to empower states and recognize states as delivery engines for the country's national goals, right, on climate. Much like the United States, Indian states, there are a lot of climate outcomes that can be decided at the state level. Power distribution, land use, agriculture, cities, and therefore urbanization. Sometimes even taxation is in the hands of state and subnational governments. For example, Catalonia has a comprehensive regional adaptation strategy with a dedicated climate fund that is financed through climate-related taxes. So they've set up a clear governance and public-private partnership, which enables the implementation of these kinds of resilient measures. And they're even using the funds created, that they generate through these taxes to create risk transfer tools to help climate vulnerable sectors of the economy. In India, in 2018, Kerala introduced a 1% flood cess on goods and services sold in the state. I mean, and it channeled all of that into disaster relief funds. This is a textbook taxation measure, right? Like, it's small, it was broad-based, progressive, and it was purpose-specific, directly linking consumption to recovery and resilience. So, India has done it as well. It's happened in places in Brazil. Quebec, of course, runs the cap and trade system, which it's linked to California through the Western Climate Initiative. I believe there's revenues of about 4 billion Canadian dollars that are channeled into a green fund, which supports clean tech, energy efficiency, just transition projects. So again, I think, the transition, not just in India, but across the world, will be lost at the state level or won at the state level and not just at the national level. The third opportunity is closing finance gaps, right? The core issue is we know that the responsibility for implementation lies with states, but the finance considerations and decisions and the whole global architecture is geared towards serving national and international markets, right? Solutions, there are a lot of solutions. You could direct finance subnational governments. Some countries do that. There is, of course, green budgeting, climate budgeting that you could look at, building bankable project pipelines. I know Abhishek and I have had a lot of conversations around this. One of the things that we did recently at the Mumbai Climate Week that happened in February is that we launched the Maharashtra Climate Investment Facilitation Program in partnership with the government of Maharashtra. So the goal of the program is to develop this pipeline of bankable and investment-ready projects to accelerate finance, not towards both climate-linked public asset projects, so large-scale infrastructure projects, but also private sector transition projects, looking at industrial clusters, industrial zones, and MSMEs. So this is a prime example of what I think Samir was talking about. Adaptation and mitigation, there's a lot of co-benefits to be had if you plan and put the money in the right kinds of projects, right? The fourth opportunity is linking energy transition to resilience and security. You've mentioned this, Abhishek. Shazia has mentioned it, so has Samir, right? Given the current sort of global geopolitical situation that we are in and the supply disruptions due to the conflict in the Middle East, fossil fuel dependence is really becoming a vulnerability, right? And I think increasingly clean energy is rising as it's a resilience measure against any of this. So energy security is now inseparable from climate policy, really. India, in that sense, and a lot of South Asia, has an opportunity to reduce their import dependence, build their domestic resilience, and stabilize costs. The fifth opportunity is to reframe adaptation as an economic strategy. Adaptation is, at the end of the day, about protecting your own growth, right? We know impacts hit productivity, we know impacts hit infrastructure, and we know impacts hit supply chains, not just at a country level or a public goods and services and infrastructure level, but also for businesses at the end of the day, right? So investing in adaptation is really going to yield you a triple dividend. You can avoid losses, you can reap economic gains, and you can build social stability, right? The state of New York did this post-Hurricane Sandy, right? They made large-scale investments in resilience, and those actually led to economic knock-on benefits that we're seeing later. So in that sense, adaptation is not really a cost. These days, it's almost economic risk management, and it's a necessity. And yeah, I'll stop there. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Aditya. I mean, these are very interesting practices, and one of the things that we discussed in COP30 was also a kind of a solution network, so that even if it is not happening in the geographies that we belong to, learning from each other always helps. And some of those solutions are also replicable. I turn back to Samir. Samir, you mentioned something which is so central to the problem that we're facing. I live in Jaipur, and it has a UNESCO World Heritage Site. One of the things that we realized is that during the peak summer, the UNESCO World Heritage Wall Site of Jaipur records 5 degrees higher temperature than the rest of the city. Now, the thing is, when we started analyzing the solution, we realized that there is very little that you can do with that compact place. So essentially, the solutions probably will have to be done at a citywide level, probably at a regional-wide level. The question that I have in my mind is that you have these kind of problems which are in every city, every geography, where you have extreme weather events seasonally happening, which is creating a lot of loss and damage. And also, you rightly referred to how it increases power costs, water costs, all kinds of costs. So one of the most difficult questions that come to us at all points in time is, how do you really tackle when the problem is so regional and so specific when it comes to resilience? And oftentimes we also see that the business models for resilient infrastructure are not straightforward, not very clear. So at NRDC, how are you thinking about extreme weather events, and what are the potential ways of looking at it, staying with the idea of solutions that Aditya spoke about?
Yeah, thanks. Beautiful city, Jaipur, of course, in Rajasthan. Some of the solutions that traditionally had been implemented in India in building habitat are still really relevant. You know, if you look at Rajasthan, for example, there was a traditional practice of having more cool white colored roofs that reflect a higher amount of sunlight and that have high emissivity. Of course, modern architecture, we're losing some of those traditional, and also the materials that were used were cooler, having ventilation and shading and orientation, like very basic, building traditions, not even technologies, like very, very simple, basic traditions. So one way cities are looking at is like, how do we have a built environment that uses this local knowledge to withstand, extreme weather events that are just getting worse. Um, there is also, like I was mentioning, cities are very keen, and states, to look at climate risk holistically. Um, Maharashtra, for example, has plans to start a new center for excellence for heat resilience and sustainable cooling. They've identified a site in Nagpur, are working on a blueprint. And so this isn't just about disaster response, which has traditionally been one set of organizations that work on disaster response, um, or cooling, which is an altogether different set of agencies that work on cooling. But this is an integrated approach on how do you look at both, come up with local evidence for solutions that work, that are implementable, and that can be supported through policy to scale up. I think so that is really interesting in terms of the finance aspect, which Aditya also referred. Like, how do you make adaptation investable? Like, that's a really challenging question. And in multilateral fora, often it comes up adaptation finance, loss and damage, and how do you quantify that? In uh, the Belém COP that was last year November in Brazil, there was the adoption of global goal on adaptation indicators on. So it's like the very first steps on what are indicators of adaptation. How do you even start to measure adaptation?
Mm.
Once you measure it, then you can monitor it, you can manage it, and you can also monetize it. Um, so I think, and NRDC has been tackling this question as well. I think Aditya mentioned that at the heart of it, it is related to development. Like, it is protecting investments. When you build climate resilient infrastructure, you're protecting investments for not just what is happening today, but for decades to come. Um, at Belém COP, NRDC and the Atlantic Council also launched a facility to work with states, cities on making these national adaptation plans more investable. Happy to share, more details on this. But that's not the only initiative. I would say, there's an active discussion going on how do you link development finance, development investments, and low carbon climate resilience as the key metrics. But yeah, I'll pause.
No, that's interesting because we work very closely with Climate Bonds Initiative at the state level, and they are just out with the climate resilient taxonomy. And at the COP30, I was on a panel with, I think, Manish Babna from NRDC, and this question came up again and again, and so was my discussion with CDRI. And it's $1 million question, and one of the things that always strike us is that oftentimes the state policies do not look at immediate costs as investments into future. And from there, the question really comes on how do you really quantify when the gains that are going to accrue in the future, because probably there are not explicit business models there. But there are also instruments, financial instruments, particularly in India, like infrastructure investment trust, which allow you to bundle projects with different rate of interest, probably something which is not yielding very high rate of interest or does not have a revenue model could also be built into it. But these are the conversations that we always feel need to be seen more at the state level. So one of the questions that I have, turning to you back to, I'll actually stay with you, Samir, on this, and then I'll go on the same question to Aditya, is that from the governance side, how do you tackle this intractable question, so to say?
The question of financing investments into resilience infrastructure. Yeah. Well, so there are several ways cities and states are looking at it. One is unlocking disaster risk reduction funding for disaster risk mitigation. For a long time, extreme weather events like heat were not classified as disasters in India. So you couldn't tackle disaster, like if there's an earthquake, immediately there's disaster relief and there's a funding allocated for things like that. But because heat is a silent killer, it doesn't happen, all of a sudden, and it's not like a single event. It took a while, and the other challenge is to associate actual morbidity and mortality with extreme climate events like heat. Like if people are hospitalized, how do you attribute whether that is due to extreme heat or exacerbating some underlying conditions? However, over a period of time, India has put in place mechanisms to be able to gather more health data, be able to quantify the impacts of extreme heat, and has NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority, has come up with guidelines on how cities and states can tap into disaster risk funding to cope with extreme heat. So that's like one public source of funding available. But then there is also philanthropic funding, there is CSR funding, and then there are blended finance mechanisms to tackle this. In several cities in India, Jodhpur, from state you're in, Abishek, has established a cooling center that they assemble in every summer, and that just provides respite from extreme heat to anyone who's outdoor at that point. And then just spending this 20 minutes inside this net zero cooling center, which is just powered by renewable energy, has ventilation and like basic things like cool water, helps bring down your core body temperature and can make a difference between literally life and death. And so now there is city investment into setting up these, not just in Jodhpur, in several cities in India. In fact, CDRI, you mentioned CDRI, NDMA, NRDC came up with a framework for cooling centers that not just India, but anywhere in the world, cities can adopt. So there's the city level public funding. There is clearly a lack of capacity, both in terms of financial resources as well as knowledge. Very few cities in India actually have a nodal climate officer or a heat officer. Generally, there is NDMA has a state disaster management arm in all the states, and they tackle multiple issues. So there is a gap, and there is a need to be able to divert and channelize more of this climate funds, more of adaptation funding into this. But you mentioned some of the initiatives that are happening, both in bonds and investment trusts.
No, I think very well said. I think one of the first points, key takeaways for us is that you need to start classifying what would constitute a disaster. And heat, I think, up until recently was not. And the reason I say that, I go back to 2012, but probably some years before that, when Ministry of Finance also undertook the exercise from the financing perspective, since you spoke about finance, this was not related to climate, but they came out with harmonized list of infrastructure to define what infrastructure is, because unless you would define something, you will not be able to mobilize the regulation, or I mean, you'll not be able to regulate or mobilize finances, or even think about governance instruments. So, point well taken, Aditya. This is operationally, because I think what Samir has spoken about is very interesting. He's raised the issue of capacity. He's raised the issue of awareness. But of course, resources are not enough. Typically, for a country like India, where debt is always a problem with states and with the center. And by the way, that's not just an Indian problem; that's a global problem right now. And operationally, and I'm really looking at a very targeted response from you, because Climate Group has been at the help of connecting not just the solutions, but also thinking what could potentially be done collectively and operationally. And the reason I say that is that the scale of the problem needs to be identified, acknowledged. The moment we would be able to identify the scale and then work backwards at the granular level, we'll be able to bundle projects where we need that finance. We'll be able to identify what the quantum that's required for that. So, any thoughts on that? How Climate Group is looking at this particular aspect of bringing the awareness together, the solutions together, and possibly even funders and different innovations on financing together, at very operational level.
Sure.
Aditya.
So just to set a little bit of context and just to perhaps add to what you and Samir have talked about, right? I think it really does come down to the point that I mentioned earlier. Like, we have to, and I kind of blame the climate community for this. Like, we get lost in the science, right? We have to start talking about it in terms of like losses avoided, economic co-benefits, social gains, because really what you need, and the vast majority of adaptation and resilience funding across the world is borne by a public budget. Like you mentioned, everyone knows public budgets are already overstressed by a multitude of other things. So if you start framing it in these manners, it unlocks two things that I think are vital, right? Like, you perhaps unlock political support for things to get pushed, reforms to get pushed, for things to be made into laws and regulations. And then, of course, it helps unlock private investments, right? And I can tell you this because there are businesses who are investing in just a lot of these resilience measures. The difference is that they're doing it in their factory boundaries or like the industrial zones that they may operate in. But they recognize it. And the reality is that they say that, hey, I'm doing this because it's business continuity. It's just a simple matter of the bottom line for me. And I can't afford to do it beyond that. Besides, it is the job of the government, so to speak, to fill in the rest, right? So there is just a strong gap in terms of both what Samir pointed out. There is a gap in terms of data at the state level, right? IMD, of course, does its own job, and all of that happens, but you need a lot of state level data as well. We do have states across the world actually who've come up to us and said that, oh, we really need to invest in some of this so we can start getting real climate data and translate impacts into dollar values, into losses, into things like that, so that we can justify budgetary allocations towards those things. So that's clearly something that needs to happen. There is a governance issue. More true, I would say, in global south than in the global north, right? But there is a governance issue where, again, a lot of perhaps developmental funding is procured at the national level, but then it's not passed on to the subnational level. Or when the subnational government tries to access developmental funding, it unfortunately winds up having to compete against national priorities for the same developmental funding pool. And at the end of the day, the developmental, the MDB or the developmental finance institution is only going to give you so much, right? It's got an allocation, it's got to fulfill, and once you cross that, then you're off the priority list. So there's that needs to happen. So one thing that we did do, and this happened in Brazil. over the last couple of years, what we've done is we've worked with about 9 states in Brazil. And just very recently in December, we concluded this whole project, right? Like it came out, 3 states managed to put together, and this was through, it started out as the Next Generation Budgets program that I talked about earlier, but it actually went well beyond that, where they took so well to the idea of how their budgets looked better, and the allocations looked better, that they actually went into project preparation with us. And 3 states and regions actually managed to put together a portfolio of about $2 billion US. And we managed to get them connected to about 30 odd investors in the region, right? And those investors weren't just there to sort of, do a stage moment and put their hands up and get their photo clicked. There was actual real expressions of interest. There were at least some sort of MOUs that I believed happened afterwards between governments and investors to say that, hey, we'll work together to fund some of these things. So we're really taking that learning, hoping to bring it through the Maharashtra Climate, in India through the Maharashtra Climate Investment Facilitation Program. I think more of this needs to happen, and I think these successes need to be replicated globally, right? I think some of the states in the US and in Canada, like I mentioned, Quebec, are doing a fantastic job with just putting in places climate-linked taxes, climate funds, risk transfer mechanisms, getting institutional investors on board to invest in resilience for the state. There's a lot of learnings that can be gotten from there and brought on board to places like India. Again, this, I think, requires our own governments and us as sort of the climate community that supports these governments to really help translate data, just sheer raw climate data into something that's a bit more palatable, a bit more understandable. And yes, a bit more, does really help unlock the support that we need. You really need to get through to the insurers at some point, right? And I think it always comes back to the point that we know that states in India have a list of climate projects that they have, and they think that these projects are great. But the truth of the matter is that there is a difference in understanding what is a bankable project from a government's perspective and what's a bankable project when you look at it from the finance communities. But there's a world of difference. And then when you go into the private sector looking for that funding, they say that, well, this is great if I was a DFI or an MDB or a philanthropy, but as a private investor, this just does not make any sense to me. It's just not going to happen. So we need to start at some point, and that requires accountability increasing to happen. It requires transparency to increase. We're working on a lot of this. We're trying to bring in, there's a lot of global transparency accountability initiatives that we're trying to take within the Under 2 coalition and bring some of those lessons here to places like India and Brazil. But yes, it is, in that sense, the problems we know are myriad and acknowledged. So it's an uphill struggle, but slowly, kind of a little bit more optimistic that, hey, there are people who are getting into position and they're beginning to understand more that, yeah, we can actually deal with some of these things. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I request also Janvi to let us know about the time, because I think we have some questions online as well. But just let us know how we're doing on time, if you're overshooting it or not. By the way, on that note, I'm happy to also report that currently I'm also part of the working party at the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, where we are engaged in public-private partnerships for climate resilient infrastructure, and those guidelines are out. You're more than welcome to make comments on that. But Samir, I just saw your message on the chat box, and you've written an article with your colleague Charu, who I've had the pleasure of meeting in Mumbai and in Brazil both. Something that really struck me is that, and staying with the idea of governance, you've spoken about climate leadership and resilience demonstrated by EU, China, and UK. So what are those lessons that can be gleaned from those leadership for India?
Yeah, I think what we were referring to in that article was, and this was just the day before India announced its NDC, was that there are countries that have resources and have also come up with pledges and commitments. But how do you really measure or define leadership? Is it the country that has maximum amount of resources, the richest countries? Are they the leaders? Are the countries with the most ambitious targets climate leaders, even if they cannot influence others or maybe not even achieve those targets? So what is true leadership? And we thought that in many ways, through demonstrable action, be it large scale renewable energy scale up or like very intentional adaptation focus, and then talking about equity in multilateral and just and fairness of the transition at multilateral forum. In many ways, India has already demonstrated leadership. As far as climate goals and pledges are concerned, I think those are really important. Like you need to have something, public facing. You need to hold yourself accountable as well, and which India has done, in the previous two versions of NDCs as well, and also achieved those well ahead of the schedule. So it seems like India should still be able to do that. But I think what truly demonstrates leadership is action. And not just domestic action, but a willingness to work with others through institutions such as the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Risk Reduction and Infrastructure, CDRI, initiatives that India has been foundational in starting. So the thought was not just what India can learn from those economies, large economies, but how India can collaborate, and it's sort of knowledge exchange. There is a lot to learn from what has happened in India as well.
No, thank you, Sameer. I think you have given all of us an agenda, and Shazia, this is something that really falls directly into your court. You work with networks of members of parliament from around the world. We have a very clear agenda, and I just want to sort of give that problematic, some kind of physiology here, is that it's not always business models that work in the climate action side. It is the investment in the future, and that's where resilience comes in. The big question that we're all dealing with here is how do we really get to that conversation in a manner that it is not just appropriate from the government side to respond to, but also for finance to flow in. And I think finance remains a big question, a big elephant in the room. I just would like to leave, I think we're coming on time in a moment, but before I turn for some last remarks, I would just like to give you a sense of what we are sensing also as an institution working very closely with several state governments, and I think globally also, is that some of the problems owing to climate challenges have become more structural rather than episodic. Fiscal stress has become structural. Climate fluctuations are far too frequent in a very short period of time. Global issues and disruptions in our supply chain are also not cyclical and predictable. And of course, technological change is very rapid. So in one line, if I were to say that the paradigm of predictable cyclical economic cycles that we were all used to doesn't exist anymore, yet financial structures and the way of governance and the way of administering things still is wedded to the old paradigm. And I think this is where we see the mismatch, and that's where we see why some of the issues related to resilience, climate finance, and scaling up of those solutions is getting a little bit more complex. But with that thought, I think I would turn to last remarks to all of our panelists, but also I would like to invite Shazia and our panelists. We can go around, again, starting from you, Sameer, a 30-second response to your final thoughts on what should we be doing looking ahead.
Well, climate change is a global problem. Climate impacts that are being felt locally and regionally today in India will tomorrow be felt in other parts of the world as well. And increasingly we see, it's not just India, it's Europe, it's US. We see, forest fires, we see extreme heat, we see flooding. All of these are happening already. So what I would say is that it isn't just about new markets or clean energy transition, but also about what we can learn from each other, not just in multilateral processes, but also subnational action, what states in the US, what cities in the US, how can they collaborate with their counterparts in India, and just learn from each other on climate risk and resilience.
Thank you, Samir. Aditya, I'll turn to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Abhishek. So quick points. I think India needs to avoid long-term infrastructure lock-in, right? Like we get current energy, economic development needs are there, but again, I think investing more and more into fossil fuels is definitely not the way. It's just increasing exposure. You need to enable states to be drivers, like we've talked about. States are the ones that are best placed to address their own local resilience issues, but you need to provide them with finance, skills, technical capacity. There's a lot of innovation states are doing, right? Northeast states like Meghalaya, Assam are doing some fantastic stuff around forest conservation, using real, traditional practices to continue, to take climate action. Governments like, Maharashtra, Gujarat are obviously all in on renewables. So there's a lot of ambition there. Again, they're doing a lot of innovations in their own way. We need to invest in just transition as well, right? That builds a social resilience that we, especially in India and the global south and in South Asia, need. Work in regions like Uttar Pradesh has shown that acting on climate can improve livelihoods, reduce forced migrations, address economic vulnerabilities, livelihood diversification, all of that. And I think there is an angle to say that India and US can actually collaborate a lot more strongly on some of these things by actually taking some of the US's shared implementation experience that it has on grid reform, energy storage, urban climate planning, upskilling, and that can help countries like India, translate the ambition into action.
Well, thank you, Aditya. We started with Shazia, so I'll turn it back to you and to Janvi for the closing remarks. Shazia, floor is all yours. You're on mute.
I was thinking of something when you were talking about what is leadership. So in terms of the members of parliament that I've worked with across the is, she's been both senator and deputy speaker, Lauren Lagarda from the Philippines. One of the laws she introduced with her colleagues in the Senate, which was passed into law in 2024, is called the PENCAS law, which is Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting System law. Essentially making it by law mandatory for both public and private sector to account in pesos for the natural resources that they're using. And I think part of the reason why we're not able to find the finance or we're not able to take certain actions even when we pass laws is that we're not actually valuing economically what we are using of the Earth's resources. And so businesses are not including that in their costs, in their profitability, in their planning, and that's really important. So I am myself following what has happened since they passed that law, how they're going to implement it through their statistical authority, through their budgeting system, and also how businesses in the Philippines will begin to implement it, because I think it's a truly model legislation, and Lauren is an incredible climate leader. So thank you very much, and I hand it back now to Janvi for closing.
Thank you all for your thoughtful remarks, and I'd like to extend a thanks generally to all of our panelists for taking the time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise, and to our audience for their participation. If you would like to follow up with any of today's speakers, please reach out to us, and we would be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the things that we've discussed today. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great day.